Social distancing is difficult. We're just not meant to live apart. We're meant to be part of community. For extroverts, it's excruciating to be out of touch. And even for us introverts, it's difficult because we like to be together. But for the time being, it's very important that we keep our distance to stay safe and slow the spread of the coronavirus. Every culture has what it calls its safe space, our personal space. You know what that's like when a stranger gets too close to you and you feel uncomfortable, or a friend pulls away and you feel distant. In America, that personal space, that safe space, with friends and family is about 2 feet. With strangers, it's about 3 feet. Go to Argentina and that space shrinks. They're much more accustomed to being closer, both with friends and family and even with strangers. Go to Saudi Arabia and the distance expands. About 3 feet between friends and family and even more with strangers. What feels right is what we're accustomed to. And when that changes, it just doesn't feel right. We're told to keep 6 feet of distance between us and others. 6 feet. Do you know where that 6 feet originally came from? In 1665, England was faced with a plague. And the mayor of London, in order to stop the spread of the plague, ordered that all the dead would be buried 6 feet under. Talk about social distancing. No wonder it doesn't feel right to us to be 6 feet apart from each other. But you know what? It is what it is. It's a temporary measure in order to address a temporary situation. And this too shall pass. But what if it wasn't temporary? What if you always felt distant and isolated from your community? What if, in spite of your best efforts, other people kept you at arm's length or more away? What if the community itself isolated you and you were powerless to change that? In the Gospels this month, we meet 3 people who always live in isolation. Last week it was the woman at the well. Jesus met her at noon, and you ask, well, why at noon? Why didn't she go to the well with the other women of the village in the morning as was customary? For whatever reason, she was distant from her community. That's why she went at noon. She was isolated and alone until Jesus entered her space. In today's gospel, it's a man who has been blind since birth. Yes, he is physically part of his community, but he might as well not be there because his very own neighbors don't even see or recognize him. They isolate him and eventually shun him. In fact, his own parents don't want to take responsibility for him. They say, he's an adult, he can answer for himself. He's isolated and alone. He's distant until Jesus enters his space and recognizes him. And then next week, we'll hear the story about Lazarus, a man who experiences the ultimate in social distancing. He dies. And by the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. Talk about a safe distance. But then Jesus calls him from the grave, and he turns the world upside down and inside out. In a way, each of these stories is a comedy. Jesus talking to a foreign woman, giving sight and insight to a man who has been blind since birth, weeping with the sisters at their brother's tragic death. And in every case, Jesus disrupts the distance and ends the isolation. Let's take a closer look at today's gospel. Jesus and his disciples encounter this man who has been blind since birth, and the disciples ask, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? We have to blame somebody. It just is human nature that we have to find fault and lay the blame on someone or something. Maybe that makes us feel better about ourselves and allows us to distance ourselves from the problem. In the ancient world, there was a belief that every misfortune was caused by someone or something, some fault, something that a person had done or his parents had done, and this is God's way of punishing. It was also a good reason for keeping one's distance, for isolating the sinner. You know, in the modern world, we believe the very same thing. We blame poor people for being poor and say, why doesn't he pull himself up by his bootstraps? Is it your fault that you're born without boots and don't have any straps to pull? We blame the homeless for being homeless, the uninsured for lacking health insurance, immigrants for wanting to emigrate. And as long as we have someone or something to blame, it's easier to distance ourselves and wash our hands of the problem. They're adults. Let them answer for themselves. But what if we were them? What if we were always kept at a distance, isolated and alone? It may turn out that the very virus that has distanced us for a time will in time draw us closer together and make us more sensitive to those people in our community who always feel distant, who always feel isolated and alone. We don't just live in an age of isolation, we live in an isolated world. A world divided between us and them, between winners and losers. As a child, I remember choosing sides for a game. Do you remember doing that? Maybe you were going to play dodgeball or baseball, or in class you were going to have a contest, a spelling bee, or some other competition. So you'd choose two captains, and the captains would choose the members of their team. The first choices were always easy and always obvious because you'd pick the best athletes or the best students first. But then you go down to the line to those who get chosen last. And they're not really chosen, they are begrudgingly accepted. Oftentimes, they're the ones that are going to sit on the bench and warm the bench. Or maybe they're the students that you say, don't answer the questions, just keep your mouth silent so that you don't ruin the game for the rest of us. If you were the last person taken, did you really feel like you were part of the team? That you were valued and accepted for who you were? Or did you feel left out, distanced, and then blamed if the game was lost and somebody had to find fault? Jesus doesn't cast blame. In fact, he turns a person's weakness into a strength. And it's this gospel from John 9 that was part of the inspiration for the hymn Amazing Grace, where the writer says, I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. We live in an isolated world where the gospel breaks through that isolation that distances us from one another. The gospel that says God chooses us, all of us, to be on God's team. The temporary isolation and distance that we're experiencing now can open our eyes to those who experience that isolation all the time. A few weeks ago, in a sermon, I said that once our eyes are opened, we can't unsee what we see. We can't shirk responsibility and say, it's not my responsibility. Find somebody else to blame. You can't say, she made me eat, or he made me eat, or that serpent made me eat. As adults, we take responsibility for our lives and for the lives and care of our neighbors, because we are part of a community. We belong together. We know how difficult it is to keep our distance, because we're not meant to live apart. Right now, it's important. It's necessary. It's healthy. But it can also open our eyes to see the people around us who always feel distant, always feel isolated, and always feel alone. It can also open our eyes to God's amazing grace that breaks through that isolation, that calls us by name and chooses us as God's children, every single one of us, all of us. The gospel of God's amazing